It was on the midnight of December 2 and 3, 1984, when tons of deadly poisonous gas had leaked into the air from Union Carbide's pesticide plant in Bhopal, the capital of the central Indian state of Madhya Pradesh. The disaster left in its wake death and destruction. Thousands of citizens were killed, and hundreds of thousands others were exposed to the toxic gas.
People who are living to the north of Union Carbide factory, more than 25,000 people are still forced to drink contaminated water on a daily basis. This water contains chemicals like trichlorobenzene, dichlorobenzene, which causes anemia and for a longer duration causes or leukemia. Then it has chemicals like metals like lead, nickel, mercury, which all causes birth retardation or birth defects.
We find that children in these communities are born with no palate, cleft lips, their digits in their hands are missing, some limbs are missing.
The abandoned plant continues to pollute groundwater on a massive scale, as the soil inside the plant area, especially its northern and northeastern side, remains contaminated by toxic chemicals.
We have waste in the vessels, pipes, containers, and we don't know how much has been placed in the ground. So we have to do a very strict and detailed monitoring of the ground and very carefully remove the material which is there. This quantity is 370 tons, which is repacked and placed in a shed under lock and key as per the order of the Supreme Court Monitoring Committee and Honorable High Court of Madhya Pradesh. Another thing which is very important and alarming, that the company has been putting lot of waste and dumping it in the ground.
Studies conducted on samples picked from the carbide site that were lying abandoned for more than 20 years have proved that the stockpile, mainly at the 7 formulation shed, contained carbaryl and HCH isomers.
Heavy metals like mercury, nickel, cadmium, which is known to cause growth retardation and mental retardation, which we are seeing in high amount of children being born in these communities. But this is another toxic legacy of Union Carbide basically. Government needs to immediately provide clean source of piped water in these communities. There needs to be a health monitoring or health research done on the people who have been drinking contaminated water on a daily basis for last 18 to 20 years.
In some areas, the groundwater has been polluted to some extent. Hence, alternative arrangements have been made at few places. The municipal corporation has put up water tanks, and water is being brought by mobile tankers to fill these tanks. Of course, this is not a permanent arrangement.
The source of the contamination of groundwater near the Union Carbide's abandoned factory is the chemical wastes that were generated in the factory from the time it began its operation in 1971. So for more than 14 years, these wastes, which are extremely toxic in nature, which are chlorobenzenes, dichlorobenzene, trichlorobenzenes, lindane and PCBs, chemicals that can cause cancers, birth defects and a whole range of systemic damages. And these wastes were dumped both within the factory premises and outside the factory in a landfill. But we know that the landfill was leaking from 1981 onwards.
It's a very grave problem which exists, and it is to be dealt with very carefully in all parts, because we have waste in the vessels, pipes, containers, and we don't know how much has been placed in the ground.
Sumitra is one of those hundreds of children who suffer from growth disorder because of the chemicals that are there in the groundwater in these communities, because of what she's drinking, and possibly because of the contamination of the breast milk of her mother, because all the mother's milk is toxic in these communities. They have chlorobenzenes, mercury, and other chemicals that are toxic to liver, kidney, and the lung.
Today, 21 years after the disaster, people in Bhopal who are exposed to the toxic gases are in no better condition. There are more than 100,000 people who still suffer from chronic illnesses because of the exposure. They have suffered diseases like tuberculosis and other complications because of damage to the immune system. Then there's been, in the last 8-10 years, we've seen a rising trend of various cancers. Cancer of the bladder is highest in the country in Bhopal. There are too many people dying of lung cancer today. And then, as Sambhavana's research has shown, even the children born to exposed parents after the disaster carry the mark of Union Carbide's poisons. So thousands of tons of very serious chemicals that are persistent in nature, that retain their toxicity for a long time, for hundreds of years in some cases. And in addition, heavy metals such as mercury, nickel and chromium, all these have been found in extremely high concentrations in several samples that have been drawn up to 3 kilometers from the Union Carbide factory. The sad fact today is that the killer factory of Union Carbide continues to leach poisons into the groundwater. Much of the government's own agencies have reported that 21% of the area within the premises are hazardously contaminated. And as you can see from inside the factory, there are large areas in which extremely toxic chemicals are half buried, sometimes just lying open. There are pits containing toxic tar from 7 unit, and all these toxic material is open to the elements. So every year there is more and more of the contaminants leach into the groundwater. Today people are not being supplied with safe water. The importance of supplying safe water was even acknowledged by the Supreme Court back in May 2004, when it directed the state government to supply safe water to all the residents of these communities. And that order of the Supreme Court remains to be implemented by the state government. Tanker water is both inadequate extremely inadequate in quantity and very poor in quality, because essentially it is the water from the upper lake that is being provided, and we know that it has high E. coli, and particularly this is problematic because of the immune system compromise that has happened in the people in these communities. And also it is extremely inadequate. We have found that at the best of times, the tankers have supplied less than 10% of the water that is required according to UNESCO standards. The Madhya Pradesh High Court had directed the state government to make arrangements so that there is no further contamination of groundwater because of these stockpiles. But what has happened is just tokenism. A very small quantity, something like 300 tons, have been kept in a very hazardous and unsafe manner inside the warehouse. But then many times more of hazardous contaminants lie exposed and continue to leach into the groundwater today.
A large population in the city has continued to suffer irreversible lung damage. The extent of their suffering is immense. They frequently fall sick, but continue to brave the crisis, and life moves on in this great city.